Stephen, we're beginning to really enter on your territory here, I think, which is the therapeutic use of stories. I know you use stories and metaphors all the time in your work. Would you like to tell us a little bit about that?
The thing about stories, they have universal appeal, and there are certain elements that everybody understands and can identify with, especially if you talk about nature in stories, even going to prehistory, sitting around a fire, looking at the stars, all of these elements, the rain, the clouds, the thunder, everybody's experienced these to a certain extent. And so any stories that have these as the cast of characters can be meaningful for almost anybody. So firstly, in therapy, no two clients are the same or two patients are the same. They have their different needs. So you need to create a story that somehow they can identify with and an emotion, basically. Now, the idea of using stories therapeutically is based on the principle of creating a story that runs in parallel to the strategy or the steps or the sequence of a person's problem, but then suggesting a resolution to that problem. And the reason we do it in metaphor and analogy is because if you just give advice to somebody directly, quite often they'll go, yes, maybe yeah, I know, I don't like that idea. They can reject it because they come in with their own ideas about what needs to be done. And generally these ideas are wrong, because if they were right, they probably wouldn't need to be there in the first place. So we want to bypass that conscious limiting belief of what needs to be done in order to get better or to get over a particular problem, regardless of whether it's a phobia, whether it's depression, whether it's anxiety or whatever. We need to find some other way that we can slip in the back door and give suggestions to the client, which are innovative and new, that they hadn't thought about, that will then inspire them to go ahead and make the changes they need to do in their life. So I've found that storytelling is an amazing tool for bringing about therapeutic change in people. And that's what I use nearly all the time. Yeah.
How did you get onto it? How did you start? How did you realize that to start with? Because it's not really very Western in a way. I grew up with that idea, but it's not a very Western idea.
Well, I'm Buddhist, so there may be a part of a teaching component to this. I've been Buddhist since I was a teenager. And of course, Buddhism is based on teaching principles, ways of living, et cetera, et cetera. It's not just a faith or religion. It's a psychology, if you like. And so when I'm doing therapy, I'm also a teacher. But I don't promote myself as a teacher because it's a different context. But therapy is about kind of teaching. It's about representing something, role modeling something to help a client. But of course, again, we don't want to do it directly in case that the suggestions we're given are rejected or just not even considered at all. We want to sow some seeds in the stories that will then initiate some kind of aha moment in the client. And I think this is so important, because if you go to a therapist and the therapist is very direct, like a counseling context where they tell you got to do this and do that and do this and do that, it's a bit authoritarian, number one. And who are we to say what someone else should do when everybody you see is different? I think it's important for the client or the patient to be able to evolve and change in accordance with their own personality. And the only way we can do that is to initiate the change through some kind of story that inspires, rather than giving them a kind of a rote learned set of steps they can tick off to get better. And I think, movement or motivation comes through having emotion. Emotion I see as the fuel that drives motivation, and motivation leads to action. And in any therapeutic context, what you're looking for is action. You're looking for a change in behavior, a change in the way a person feels and thinks. And so a story that initiates a change in the thought, that then initiates a change in the emotion, initiates a change in the behavior, is going to be very effective for helping a client.
And we've got a question from the audience. Does listening to a story have the same healing effect as telling a story? is storytelling a soul medication for both the creator and the admirer? Does he, maybe this person means the creator and the person who's listening to it. I don't know, is it a two-way street, storytelling and listening?
I've spent most of my life telling stories, so I can only say, well, yes, I feel good
haven't
about
been
that.
listening.
No, I've been listening to my own stories. I think if you're telling stories which are inspiring, you can't help but get a bit of that for yourself. But no, to answer the question to your listener, it's really the person who's listening. You know, that's the person who gets the most benefit. And let me just mention a little bit about stories in therapy. What we've been talking about so far are stories about culture, about understandings, perceptions that come from different cultures. Now, if you're working with a client, what stories do you tell? It has to be stories that they can relate to directly themselves. So the best way I've found in doing something therapeutic is not to tell a story from the past, but tell a story from the very present. That is the moment you're with that client. And so what I do is I listen to the client's ups and downs and all the mistakes they've made, and I can see where they're stuck. And if I can see where they're stuck, I know how to get them unstuck. So I have to create a story in the moment, spontaneously, specifically for them, that mirrors the structure of their problem and their frustrations and the errors they've made, and then suggest an outcome, a way of getting out of that. I can't do that by reciting a well-known folk tale, for example, unless it happens to be really very, very specific. So I have to be very general. I still use things like nature because people can identify with them, with that. But what I'll want to do is to create a story in the moment. And I think what is strange for me is, and I didn't really realize this until it was starting to happen. You know, initially, I kind of worked out stories, thought about what would work here. But I think, like anything else, if you want to learn something, if you do lots of repetition, like playing the piano, eventually your hands play without you having to think about it. And so I started creating stories in the moment. And when I started a story, I had no idea how it would end. And this became absolutely fascinating, of course, because it's scary at first. But then when you realize there's a part of you that knows how to do it, it's no different from playing an instrument or driving a car, anything that becomes automatic. It's the same process. So these are stories which are created in the moment. Sometimes I'll use the same story again with another client, depending if they're a similar client. But quite often, every story, I haven't even heard it myself when it happens. And for me, I suppose I am a storyteller, but I'm actually a story creator, if you like. But the raw materials are the person I have in front of me. So they should be taking the credit for the story. I'm just a facilitator of the story.